If Trump fulfills his election campaign promises on changes to U.S.-Cuba relations, what will it mean going forward? We've heard from Michelle and Sean. Now let's get more analysis. We're joined now by Ted Henken. He's an author and professor in the Department of Black-and-Latino Studies at Baruch College, and Jaime Suchlicki. He's the director of the Institute for Cuban and Cuban-American Studies. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. It's expected he's probably going to curtail significant aspects of the thawing that we saw in the Obama administration, perhaps imposing some restrictions on U.S. companies doing business with Cuba. Ted, give me your sense of what you think we're going to hear tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks to some early reporting from the Miami Herald, I feel like what we can anticipate is the following. I think that Trump, ironically, is going to leave most of the framework that Obama established in place, including the embassies. He's going to maintain diplomatic relations with the Cuban government. He's going to also not touch changes that would affect the Cuban-American community's right or ability to travel to Cuba and send remittances to Cuba. And I think he's even going to leave alone and allow the regularly scheduled commercial flights and even cruise ships to go to Cuba. What the focus we can expect tomorrow from Donald Trump will be tomorrow is to try to end any kind of economic relationship that has developed between U.S. businesses and the Cuban government. The Cuban government controls the lion's share of the Cuban economy, especially in the tourism industry, and especially with under the head of the military in Cuba. The military gradually has transformed itself into an economic player over the last 25 years, and a large part of the tourism industry is run by the military. And some early deals between the United States and Cuba were deals between U.S. companies like Starwood and Marriott and the Cuban military that runs certain parts of the hotel industry and the airline industry within Cuba. So I think that's going to be the focus, to try to fight against the internal control of the economy and any deals between the U.S. and the Cuban government.
Jaime, I know that you were pretty critical of Obama, that the U.S. didn't really get anything out of this deal. Does this make you happy? I mean, is Trump going far enough in your estimation, if this is what actually happens tomorrow?
Well, he's going to go further than Professor Henken is talking. Trump will be emphasizing the importance of the embargo both in his verbal speech and at the United Nations. He's also going to curtail travel by American tourists to Cuba, where he will maintain the categories of people that can go as a group to Cuba. Individual travel by tourists will be curtailed. And as Professor Henken has said, he will emphasize the need to curtail commercial relations between Cuba and Cuban businesses that are owned by the military. I think that this is a first step. There's going to be a lot of regulations that will come later. If it makes me happy, well, giving away policy without any return on the part of the Cuban government doesn't make me happy. And I think that the Cuban government has given very little for the concessions that the Obama administration gave them. Cuba is an ally of Venezuela, Iran, Russia, Syria, North Korea, the worst anti-American regimes in the world. So Cuba is not opening up its economy and is not opening up the political process. As a matter of fact, since Obama's changes, more repression has taken place in the island and more dissidents are being thrown in jail. So I don't think that a policy of appeasement on a dictatorship that violates human rights is the right policy.
Ted, let me ask you this. It seems as though, and we noticed it in Sean Caleb's reporting, that there's been a softening in terms of attitudes among many Cuban Americans, saying that this policy didn't work. They sort of feel like it's a big mistake. Talk to me about how attitudes have shifted, and is that going to have any impact one way or the other?
Well, one thing I'm sure that Jaime would agree with me on is that even though it's likely that attitudes have shifted, especially generational attitudes, grandparents, parents, and grandchildren, that attitude shift has not represented itself in the ballot box. The people who represent most Cuban Americans are Cuban-American elected officials, not only support Trump's policy, but have been lobbying him very directly and very hard to make sure that he set up a different deal, a better deal than the one Obama struck. However, it is true that increasing studies and surveys show that not only majorities of Republicans, but also majorities of Cuban Americans support, not always enthusiastically, but support or are willing to try a new approach, given the fact that, as one of the people who were interviewed said, that the old approach, even if it maybe had the right philosophy or had the right moral focus on punishing the Cuban government, never really changed the Cuban government's behavior and actually made the people of Cuba suffer. And many Cuban Americans, of course, are divided because they're not big fans of the Cuban government, but they may have relatives in Cuba that they want to help, they want to visit. And so I think if Trump is smart, and that's a big question, but if he's smart and strategic in his policy, he will try to preserve the things that benefit Cuban American families and Cuban businesses that are in the private sector and separate out the punishment or the conditions or cutting off any business with the Cuban government.
Well, he will be talking directly tomorrow for support of the Cuban cuentapropistas, or the little small enterprises that have developed in Cuba over the years. What he's going to emphasize is lack or prohibiting investments in companies that are owned by the military or involved with the military.
Gentlemen, I hate to say it, but we've run out of time. Thanks so much for both of you joining us. I really appreciate it.